Greetings and welcome to Lecture 15. You may have noticed these last couple lectures I've tried something a little bit different. I've got the slideshow a little bit smaller, so maybe a little bit harder to read, but I've also got it so my face is covering up less of the slideshow, so that might help a little bit. Generally speaking, you'll just kind of miss a little piece of that Bible reading, but you hear me say it. So hopefully it wasn't too difficult before, but maybe it'll be better now. So with this lecture, we're going to get into Jesus' views on violence. This one's going to be a little bit longer than the last ones we've done because there's a lot in here to think about, and let's get into it. We're going to start at chapter 5, verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. Or turn the other to him also, depending on which translation you're reading. So this, I would say, is the most obvious place in this sermon where Jesus flat out seems to just contradict Moses. Moses, or the law of Moses, if you like, gave a principle of justice for law, that one cannot exact more than what they're owed after an offense against them. So just enough to balance out and kind of restore or, something to that effect. So, the principle that if someone knocks out your tooth, you can knock out their tooth, or, the just compensation that would equal that. Jesus is actually saying, don't live by this principle, that we should be willing to receive violence rather than to inflict it back against an enemy. Now, Moses' principle has to do with principles of law, whereas I think Jesus seems to be going a little bit further than that, because the slap on the cheek doesn't really seem to be in a courtroom context, but it's about exacting fair recompense, retaliating in equal measure. So Jesus is sort of taking that basic legal principle and sort of expanding it to be a larger principle of justice. Now, a number of scholars have pointed to the significance of a detail in Matthew's version of the sermon that's missing in Luke's. And that detail is that the first slap that one receives is on the right cheek. If whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. So a slap on the right cheek is, among right-handed people, going to be a backhanded slap. And likely one that would be received at the hand of these sort of conquering Roman authorities who were living in Palestine and subjugating the Judeans, the Jewish people. So by turning the left cheek, one is refusing to retaliate, yes, but they are also perhaps demanding to be treated as an equal and shaming their oppressors, right? By saying, I'm not someone you can backhand, I am equal to you. So to shame an oppressor in this way, you must be willing to suffer indignity yourself. That's true. But as Keener writes, if their lives are forfeit when they begin to follow Jesus, they have no honor of their own to lose. So is that perhaps part of what's going on here, that the person is sort of demanding to be treated as an equal even as they refuse to retaliate? I'd say that's possible. I actually think it's very possible. What I will say, especially if you're looking at just Luke's version, is that the non-retaliation piece is the central piece. And the demanding your rights even as you refuse to retaliate is maybe secondary. But, you sort of see these kinds of principles in nonviolent revolutions and nonviolent struggles. You look at the civil rights movement in the United States, and it was quite a lot like that. You look at Gandhi's movement for Indian independence, it was quite a lot like that. It basically says, hit me if you want, stick your dogs on me if you want, hit me with the fire hose. I'm not going to retaliate, but I am going to make you sort of come face to face with what you're doing and my humanity, right? And so that could very well be part of what Jesus is doing here, in which case Jesus is giving us a pretty early plan for civil disobedience. He wasn't the only person who did civil disobedience in a nonviolent way. There are actually a lot of examples of Jews around that time doing the same thing. There's one where Caligula was trying to get an image of himself, or an image of, it might have been himself or a god, it probably was himself, placed in the temple, and the Jews refused and were willing to die rather than let this happen. And there's another instance too with Pilate. All of the details are a little bit fuzzy in my head right now. But essentially, Jesus was not the only person who, at this time, who engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience. And incidentally, both of those examples that I mentioned were successful. Now, nonviolence is not always successful, but neither is violence. So, anyway. So yes, we'll move on a little bit, now that we sort of talked about the civil disobedience piece, to the question of what does turning the other cheek actually mean? So it seems to be an application of a principle, but what is that principle? Is Jesus commanding nonviolence here, or is he commanding something else? So what some have said, who want to argue that this isn't really a principle of nonviolence, they've said, well, this is just an insult. It's a slap. It's not really about how you respond to physical brutality. It's more about how you respond to insults, right? Here's another question. We discussed exceptions in the New Testament which allow for divorce, but we don't really find any exceptions for Christians engaging in violence, either here or really anywhere in the New Testament. Is this because there are none? Are there no exceptions where Christians can engage in violence? Or can followers of Jesus sort of be practical, so to speak, about making exceptions? Are we allowed to use violence when it seems like that's the right thing to do, or the smart thing to do? And going back to this whole thing, all these principles that Jesus is giving us, that we, the living as if the kingdom of God has already come, the whole thing where we're following this guidance that seems really impractical. If there is no God, but if there is, and he's going to make everything right, then it becomes practical again. So is being practical in the sense, sort of a secular sense, just focusing on this life, is that at odds with living in the, not of this world kingdom of God? So if someone, believes in this sort of Christian worldview and, God and heaven and eternity and all that stuff, and then they're saying, well, let's be practical about this and not really do what it says, literally, are they missing the point? Are they sort of failing to understand what it means to be part of the kingdom of God? Or should we be practical in order to, if you're going to make the argument that there are times where violence or lethal force can save lives, more lives in the end, shouldn't we just go ahead and do that? So that's kind of where you see a lot of the debates around how you apply this passage. All right, so what accounts for this change regarding violence between Moses and Jesus? So I would say that the most likely answer is that the kingdom that Jesus announced is not an earthly kingdom like Israel was. Jesus has something a little bit different in mind. It's a spiritual kingdom, right? It's coming. It's within the people of God. It's sort of here. It's present. It's here. It's there. It's everywhere. But it's not like an earthly kingdom, which is sort of focused in one place. And this is the reason that Jesus gives in John's gospel to Pilate for why his followers didn't take up arms against Rome to have Jesus released. He says, well, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, then my servants would fight. So there's this sort of connection that Jesus makes between having an earthly kingdom and using violence. If you don't have an earthly kingdom, then you don't need to use violence. That's sort of the rationale. Going back in church history, what you're going to find is that there's been a large consensus up until fairly recent times that this non-retaliation, non-violence thing applies to a Christian, the follower of Jesus's personal life. That even self-defense is sort of suspect. However, what you'll sort of find after the first few hundred years of the church is a different perspective. You'll see Augustine, you'll see all the way up to the Reformers, Martin Luther, John Calvin, arguing against self-defense, but for Christians serving in the military, serving as executioners, performing a government function of violence, right? So the question is, does Jesus' teaching here also apply to the government? Because government, whether you like it or not, is ultimately its primary, or perhaps its only tool, is really violence or the threat of violence. Government's not making a suggestion. That's not what a law is. A law has behind it the threat of force, right? So should the government give up on violence? If Jesus is saying give up on violence, does that command extend to the state? And if it doesn't extend to the state, if the state can still use violence, but Christians can't, can Christians use violence for the state? Or are they obligated to refuse it? So Martin Luther, whom I mentioned, developing the 4th century church father Augustine's view, gave one influential answer, and his answer is what's today called the two kingdoms view, that Christians are part of two kingdoms simultaneously, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of men. And as a result, a Christian should be nonviolent in their private lives, but they could be a soldier or executioner as a citizen of their country. On this subject, he wrote, quote, "When Christians were called to arms, even by infidel emperors and lords, they went to war. In all good conscience, they slashed and killed, and in this respect there was no difference between Christians and heathen. Yet they did not sin against this text, for they were not doing this as Christians for their own persons, but as obedient members and subjects under obligation to a secular person and authority. But in areas where you are free and without obligation to such a secular authority, you have a different rule, since you are a different person." So Luther saw the kingdoms as separate, but he also saw Christians as being part of both kingdoms. To Luther's right are views like theocracy, theonomy, dominionism, Christian nationalism. You can look up all those words if you like. Christian nationalism has kind of become the catch-all term for all these sort of different views. And ultimately, what they argue is that church and state can be mixed together to a larger degree without ruining one or both. However, in these approaches, gaining political power oftentimes can trump this principle of Christian nonviolence. Christian nonviolence sort of tends to go out the window in a lot of these contexts. So just to give an example, there's a megachurch pastor whose church has a Freedom Sunday celebration where they sing patriotic hymns. And a few years ago, he had this to say about his support of a candidate running for political office, whom I won't mention, but you can probably guess who I'm talking about. Quote, "When I'm looking for a leader who's going to fight ISIS and keep this nation secure, I don't want some meek and mild leader or someone who's going to turn the other cheek. I've said I want the meanest, toughest SOB I can find to protect this nation." So ultimately what he's saying is he doesn't actually want someone to lead this country who follows these principles of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, he's not saying that a Christian should not be in office. So that's an interesting distinction. So he doesn't have any problem with that. He's just saying that while they're in office, they shouldn't behave in a way that you would expect a Christian to behave, following the commands of Jesus. Now, to Luther's left is the Anabaptist early church view, and it calls for separation between church and state, like Luther did, but it argues that Christians cannot be faithful citizens of two kingdoms. Christians, in this view, are not two persons. Each Christian is not two persons, but he is, or she is, only one person. So from the Anabaptist early church perspective, God may have a purpose for state violence in his divine plan, but Christians are to have no part in it. So these groups therefore would argue that Christians cannot be soldiers or executioners, and probably not police either, and perhaps should have no role in government at all, but particularly where violence comes in. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom I've mentioned, though he was a Lutheran, he sort of concurred with the Anabaptists on this one. He argued that, quote, Luther's distinction between private person and bearer of an office is foreign to Jesus. He addresses his disciples as people who have left everything behind to follow him. Private and official spheres are all completely subject to Jesus' command, and Jesus demands undivided obedience. So on the far left end, farther left than the Anabaptists, what you might call Christian progressivism, which, like the far right, doesn't see a clear church and state separation, but unlike the far right, believes that the state should be more like Jesus. Though not actually a Christian, but a self-described Christ-loving atheist, author Kurt Vonnegut summed up this position pretty well when he said, quote, for some reason, the most vocal Christians among us never mention the Beatitudes, but often, with tears in their eyes, they demand that the Ten Commandments be posted in public buildings. And of course, that's Moses, not Jesus. I haven't heard one of them demand that the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, be posted anywhere. Blessed are the merciful in a courtroom. Blessed are the peacemakers in the Pentagon. Give me a break, unquote. So I've put together a chart to maybe kind of help make sense of this. And what you'll notice is that this graph or this chart that I've made is almost a circle. And that's because the far left and the far right views actually share a similar point of view. They both believe in this strong union between Christian ideas and the state. At the top, you have the Lutheran and Anabaptist views, and they share a strong belief in the division of church and state. So that's the top and the bottom. On the right side, you'll see the state's prerogatives ultimately trump the church's commitment to nonviolence. So the right side doesn't really believe in nonviolence. The left side does believe in nonviolence, and they would say that it's more important that Christians follow that nonviolent command from Jesus as opposed to serving the state's prerogative for violence. So left side, Christians can't use violence. Right side, Christians can use violence. Top, church and state are separate. Bottom, church and state are joined. All right, follow-up questions. Or maybe take-home questions. Is Luther's view akin to serving two masters, which is a reference to something else Jesus has said, that one cannot serve two masters, a divided loyalty. This idea of purity of heart. Are you willing one thing, or are you willing two things that contradict each other? So is Luther getting us in trouble with Jesus by arguing for these sort of two masters, two kinds of loyalties? Really two persons. Second question, might the left side, the views that sort of take a nonviolent position, allow for evil people to abuse others? So here's an example. The civil rights activist Malcolm X famously criticized Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach, writing about, quote, Negroes who would shout for the pie in the sky and their heaven in the hereafter, while the white man had his here on earth, end quote. So if we understand Jesus to be preaching pacifism, is he in effect siding with oppressors? Well, keep these points in mind. First of all, someone who doesn't believe in God might claim that the oppressor is ultimately not held accountable, and that it's better to seek justice now by any means necessary. But from Jesus' perspective, God does not side with the oppressors, but he will make sure that justice is done. So Jesus is taking a long view that this life isn't all that there is. We don't have to necessarily be the judge and jury and executioners ourselves in every situation to make sure that right is done. A second thing to keep in mind is that Jews under Roman occupation actually had very little chance of overthrowing their oppressors through force. This means that Jesus' approach of nonviolent resistance would have actually been much more effective for them. In point of fact, they did try to violently overthrow the Roman oppressors, and it went about as horribly as it could have gone. Jesus' approach, I think, would have been ultimately a better approach. In point of fact, a recent study by Erica Chenoweth, detailed in her book Why Civil Resistance Works, showed that nonviolent political resistance is more effective than violent resistance. Nonviolence is more difficult, and it's less satisfying to, sort of our desire to punish our enemies, or kind of do the dirty, hairy thing, or the or the death wish thing, um, but it doesn't mean that it's doing nothing. Nonviolent resistance actually can accomplish quite a bit. Finally, Jesus doesn't just want tit-for-tat justice. Ultimately, he's looking for a way to make peace and win over our enemies, and this can't be accomplished by targeting them for violence. So might the left side viewpoints allow for evil people to abuse others? That is, I think, the concern that's generally raised, but there are reasons to think that nonviolence is not as ineffective or passive as some might suggest that it is. It can be, for sure. Sometimes nonviolent, not doing anything is a form of nonviolence, for sure. But sometimes doing something nonviolently is better than doing something violently, right? Third question or concern: does Christian nationalism put power and the desire to get power above the gospel? Are Christians who are sort of promoting a Christian nationalism, are they obeying Jesus? Are they preaching the message? Or are they more focused on just keeping themselves in power? Because that is the danger of power, of course, is that it corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as Lord Acton said. Finally, which view do you associate with Jesus in the New Testament? Like growing up, if you thought about Christianity, did you think of it as a nonviolent teaching? Where on that circle would you put it? And as we're discussing this and you're thinking about it, do you feel like one view makes more sense now, which seems closer to the truth now? There's not really a right or wrong answer to that, but it's sort of a take-home question, I suppose. What do you think Jesus is actually saying about violence here? Do you feel like one reading holds up better? Anyway, take that home and think about it, and I will see you when we start Lecture 16. Thank you.